Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us as we host the ARELLO and Zillow Private Listing Networks webinar. I'm going to give it just a few seconds here to allow everyone to get on. We have quite a crowd today. So thank you again for joining us, and panelists, thank you also for coming on. But good afternoon. Hopefully it is getting warmer wherever you may be this afternoon. My name is Jessica Hickok, and I am the CEO of ARELLO, which stands for the Association of Real Estate Licensed Law Officials. And we're happy to co-host this webinar with Zillow this afternoon to talk about the rise of private listing networks, or PLNs. So we have a record-breaking attendance. We have well over 500 people registered for this event. We are recording this event, and we will send a recap after it is processed so that you can take a look back at it or share it as you see fit. But I definitely want to give a huge shout out to the team at Zillow for helping us co-host this very important panel, very important topic that we have going on. We have several members on the call that are ARELLO members, that are Realtor members, that are industry participants, that are very immersed in what it is that is happening in our industry. So we are excited to bring everybody together. I will tell you that in this call today, we are giving just a very brief overview of the rise of PLNs, or private listing networks. PLNs, what they are, the relevance that they have to the industry. A private listing network is a database of homes that's only accessible to certain parties. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that is, but I will tell you that in conjunction with Zillow, ARELLO is happy to host this. And if you are not familiar with ARELLO and who we are, as I mentioned, we are the Association of Real Estate Licensed Law Officials, and we are the National Trade Association representing the state regulators who are issuing licenses and overseeing the license law. And so we are happy to participate in this discussion and host this discussions because we think that information is extremely important. We'd like to just kind of level set PLNs, what they are, how they're happening, and where we are in the whole industry from every perspective. So again, thank you for joining us. A few examples of PLNs are going to be given by our panelists, and we are very excited to introduce them. So what I want to offer up before I make these introductions is a QR code to everyone who is watching their screen right now. If you have a question throughout this panel, we definitely want you to send that question in, and we'll do our best to get it answered the best we can live here. But we are expecting about an hour for this conversation to last. And with that, we are also going to go about 40 minutes, and then we'll be able to answer some of these questions. So if you have a question, feel free to dive in and let us know what you're thinking so that we can join the conversation all together. So we are fortunate today to be joined by four frontrunners of the industry in the PLN conversation. So I'd like to introduce them real quick, and then we'll kick it off. First, we have Art Carter. Art is the CEO of the California Regional MLS, or CRMLS, the nation's largest MLS, serving over 110,000 subscribers. And Art is a very tenacious advocate for brokers who lead initiatives for MLS data sharing in California and beyond. So welcome, Art. Glad you are here today. In addition to that, yeah, happy to have you here. In addition to that, we also have Errol Samuelson from Zillow. Errol is the Chief Industry Development Officer for the Zillow Group. He's got over 30 years of experience in technology and real estate, and Errol has been very instrumental in shaping Zillow's partnerships and innovations since joining the company in 2014. So ARELLO, welcome. Errol, Errol ARELLO, we love that. Thank you and welcome for being here. Further on our panel, I have two more. We've got Laurie Benner. Laurie is the Associate Vice President of Housing and Community Development for the National Fair Housing Alliance, a civil rights nonprofit organization. And her portfolio focuses on national programs, partnerships designed to provide equitable access to fair and affordable housing opportunities. But prior to joining NAFA, or the National Fair Housing Alliance, Laurie was on the staff at the Maryland Association of Realtors. So she's got a lot of industry experience that she's bringing to the table also. So welcome, Laurie. Glad to have you here. And then last but certainly not least, we are honored to have ARELLO's 2025 president, Janet Thoren, who is the legal counsel the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. And she's bringing with her more than 20 years of experience and oversees the regulation for over 100,000 brokers and firms in North Carolina. So Janet, we're always honored to have you on our shows as well. So thank you for taking the time to do that. So let's hop into the questions. So Art, I'm going to kick it off to you. As the head of the nation's largest MLS, can you help us understand what private listing networks are, and where did they come from, and how do they operate?
Sure. I think it's probably important for me to kind of give you guys a little bit of a level set when it comes to the idea of private listing networks. When you talk about a private listing network, the private part comes from the fact that it is off MLS, and what I will refer to as off market as well. So the private listing network is a collection of listings from sometimes just one brokerage, sometimes from multiple brokerages that are in the whole network itself is intended to be exclusive. I talk about the multiple listing service as being on market. I have over 27,000 websites that I distribute data to, and it is a very open and productive process for the consumer to visit any number one of those 27,000 websites in order to gather information. The private listing network is really, as I said, more intended to be an exclusive, limiting the amount of eyeballs that are on that property, either to people that are visiting a specific brokerage's website or visiting either a multiple listing services off-market website, or just a separate company that is operating a private listing network. So that's kind of the flavors of what we're looking at. They came into being for a wide variety of reasons, and there is a thought process that sellers deserve some choice as to whether or not their properties are on or off multiple listing service, the multiple listing service. We've always allowed for those capabilities, but this new iteration of PLNs, especially the broker-specific ones that are only displaying their own listings within that platform, is a little bit different of a flavor. And we'll dive into a little bit more of what the problems and complexities that the PLNs bring up into the marketplace.
Definitely. I know that this is definitely not your first rodeo in dealing with private listing networks and, the different creative ways that have gone around MLSs in a lot of things.
Correct.
So, Errol, Zillow has the unique ability to observe national trends and shifts in the marketplace. Can you help us understand from your perspective how PLNs are and could impact the industry and consumer experience?
Yeah, happy to, Jessica, and thank you for having me here today. To put it simply, PLNs are bad for sellers, bad for buyers. They hurt agents. They reduce competitiveness in the brokerage community. Those are all pretty bold statements, so I'll back them up. We just finished doing a survey and analysis of almost 3 million listings from 2023 and 2024. We compared listings that were sold on the MLS versus listings that were sold off MLS, typically either a pocket listing held by an agent or a listing that was in one of these brokerage exclusive private networks where only agents inside the brokerage gets to see the listing. And here's what we found. We found that the typical listing that was sold off MLS, the seller left almost $5,000 on the table. The impact was even worse in some states. If you go to California, the typical California seller who put their listing in a private network or sold it off MLS lost $30,000, $14,000 in New York and New Jersey, $20,000 in Massachusetts. So a lot of harm there happening to sellers. And by the way, the impact is even greater when you look at the lower end of the market. So if you look at the bottom 5% of the priced homes compared to the top 5%, the bottom 5% was harmed 7 times as much as the top 5%. So these are people, this is probably their biggest opportunity to generate wealth, and they're being harmed by having their brokerage or their agent convince them to put the listing into a private network. And I say convince them because we did a consumer survey where we found that 2/3 of Americans didn't know the difference between a private network and putting their listing on the MLS. So seller harm And we believe sellers are not getting adequate disclosures. They're not being informed about the impacts of whether they wish to put their listing on the MLS or off. And look, we'll acknowledge there are some instances. It might be a celebrity home. There may be other reasons you wish to market your listing privately, but you need to understand as a seller what that means in terms of how quickly it's going to sell or what you're going to get. So bad for sellers. Bad for buyers. One of the biggest challenges we're facing right now is affordability. And part of the issues related to affordability are related to levels of inventory. So we're still about 26% below the pre-pandemic inventory levels. And you get brokerage hiding listings in these private networks, reducing the inventory available to most consumers. That's going to create affordability problems. It's also going to create the issue that maybe your dream home is out there, but you didn't see it because it wasn't publicly available. And then finally, bad for brokerage competition, bad for agents. And the reason I say that is that these private listing networks are primarily being operated by the mega brokerages, national large brokerages. And so if you're an agent at a smaller brokerage or an independent brokerage, and you don't have access to those listings, it's really hard for you to compete for buyers, because buyers, even if they would like to work with you at your indie brokerage, the buyer feels obliged to perhaps go work with the larger brokerage because that's the only way they can get access to those listings that are held behind the velvet rope. And so we think as we see the proliferation of more and more listings going off market, being hidden inside these large brokerages, we think you're going to see a consolidation of brokerages as agents feel that they have no choice to go join these large brokerages, and buyers feel they have no choice but to work with those large brokerages in order to get access to this off-market data. So bad for sellers, bad for buyers, bad for competition. And again, like I say, there are edge cases where perhaps privacy is important. And as Art pointed out, there's ways to do that today. But moving the bulk of the listings in this country into these private databases is really, really bad for consumers.
If I can, Jessica, just give everybody an idea. Part of our rule set is that there must be that disclosure out to the seller that the listing will be held off of the multiple listing service. And some of the difficulties we have is whether or not that disclosure has been explained fully. As everybody's well aware, there are hundreds of forms that you're signing in a real estate transaction, and truly understanding what you're putting your signature on. We're a little bit dubious as to whether or not the seller has had this fully explained to them.
You know, Art, we did a consumer survey in January that we conducted with Harris Poll, and we asked potential sellers, hey, would you like to put your listing on the MLS or in a private network? And for those who said they thought there were some advantages to putting their listing in a private network, when we had a follow-up question that said, did you understand if you did that, you're going to leave this amount of money on the table? Almost half of them changed their mind on the spot, saying, oh, I didn't realize that. I'll put my listing on the MLS rather than the private network. Most sellers, when you ask them what they're looking for, when we do our consumer surveys, the top two things they want: sell for the highest price, sell on time. The way you do that is by getting the most exposure.
Yeah, very valid points. And we appreciate that. That was a fascinating report that was published, and a lot of good statistics in there. There's pros and cons, obviously, for all participants here. But I know the one thing that we have in common is how is the consumer being best served. And so, Laurie, if I could kind of turn it a little bit of a different direction and talk about how the National Fair Housing Alliance has been very outspoken against the use of pocket listings. Can you help us understand why and how NAFA views the emergence of private listing networks?
Sure, Jessica, thank you. First, I'd kind of like to reframe the question a little bit as a re-emergence rather than an emergence of these private listing networks, because as we all know, the real estate industry has long been exclusionary. Many features of today's laws and regulations exist because of a deeply inequitable historic structural practices. So by nature, something that's exclusive excludes someone else. It's the cachet of the have and the have not. So NAFA cautions real estate practitioners against using these PLNs or pocket listings to sell homes, because they may not have the home seller's best economic interests in mind, and because they deflate the pool of potential home buyers but also because they could have a discriminatory effect. So, Errol talked about this, these multitudes of studies that have shown that homes listed on an MLS sell for a higher price. But more important, at least from where I sit at NAFA, is the adverse impact on consumer choice. PLNs allow a select group of agents to gatekeep homes and only allow certain people to view them. And at its very basic, that's segregational. So we have to consider the fair housing principle of disparate impact as well. And that really means that a policy or a practice is not discriminatory on its face, but it ends up having that effect. So I could tell you that housing advocates are watching this very closely. It's inherently difficult to track these transactions because of the private or exclusive nature of them. But fair housing investigators and testers can certainly adapt their techniques to, in response to this. So agents should be very, very cautious because the Fair Housing Act still is the law of the land. And I think I'll close just by really reiterating that anything that limits opportunity and reduces transparency is antithetical to a fair and democratic housing market. So I'm glad this forum is digging into this very important issue.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for your perspective on that. You touched on the privacy of these networks and the access to it, which segues great into the next question that we have. Janet, if you are willing to take us through and walk us through the perspective from the regulators, give us your thoughts and what role you believe real estate regulators are playing related to private listing networks and what we should watch for.
Sure, Jessica. Thank you for that question. I do think private listing networks are something that all regulators need to be aware of and in tune with how they may impact the marketplace and consumers. Generally speaking, real estate boards and commissions don't regulate the platforms that are used for marketing listings. They regulate the licensees and their conduct and behavior themselves. But there are several regulatory concerns that may extend themselves to the typical private listing network. First, I think, as Laurie already discussed, there is the possibility that advertising a property only on a private listing network may lead to violations of state or federal fair housing laws. Those laws prohibit discrimination in housing, we all know, based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, and familial status. When you restrict the visibility of properties on the market to a select group, that can eliminate housing opportunities for many other individuals. And typically individuals from marginalized communities may see fewer or none of these listings. And so they may not have those properties available to them as choices in the marketplace. Regulators and brokers may see an increase in fair housing complaints because of that limited accessibility. The second big area with private listing networks where I see regulators having an interest will be in the disclosures being made to buyers, and particularly those being made to sellers. Having a listing advertised in a private, exclusive, and off-market site limits the exposure of that property in the marketplace. We've heard that mentioned already. This can lead to longer days on the market, and some argue lower sales prices due to that limited exposure. I know that Zillow recently did a study they were just, Errol was talking about, and there was a 2023 multi-state study done by the Bright MLS and Drexel University that found that homes listed between 2019 and early 2023 and advertised on the MLS sold for a little over 17% more than comparable off MLS listings. So sellers may choose to only have their properties marketed on a private listing network, but they need to have full disclosure of how that might impact them financially. And I think regulators need to be considering whether the disclosure requirements are adequate for those types of transactions. Another issue I would raise is that the choices a buyer has for representation. Buyers may find themselves limited in their choices for representation if they want access to properties that are only on a private listing network. They may have to choose an agent solely to get access to that private listing network rather than picking an agent that's a right match for them. Regulators may see an increased use of dual agency with private listing networks where a buyer needed to use the same agent or an agent in the same firm in order to have access to a particular property. So there's regulatory risk there for the brokers who will need to be able to demonstrate that they've acted properly in the role if they're serving as a dual agent. I think we also have to have some concern about the impact of private listing networks and information on listings. That information is critical for brokers who are trying to determine the appropriate list price for a new listing, but they might not have access to sales prices or other data for properties listed on that are only listed in the private listing networks. And what about appraisers? Will they have access to that data as well? They use that data for their own reports. Pricing trends may become less transparent and harder to predict. Besides pricing, it might be difficult to determine market conditions and available housing inventory. So access to information is not something that most real estate boards and commissions regulate currently. It may be an area where some regulators start to become involved in order to keep the data in a transaction as transparent as possible. And finally, I just think everyone should keep in mind that there may be some states that do have regulations that may apply to these private listing networks. And many MLSs have specific rules about the use of private listing networks for their members. So please check on a local level if you are considering using this as an option and make sure that you stay in compliance.
Yeah, that's all great stuff. One thing that I know that in the conversations you and I have had about it, very bluntly put, you said, as long as it's accurate, if people are asking, you've got accurate data on there and you're in compliance, then that's good. So I appreciate that. Jenna, if we can continue on with that, and we do have a question here, kind of private listings and pocket listings appear to be issues that have been historically controlled and policed by the industry. Why do we think that this could become a regulatory issue on top of that?
Well, I think that the growth of the private listing networks is going to have some impact on the need for regulators to look a little more closely at what's happening here. And I differentiate between a pocket listing and a private listing network. For me, a pocket listing is something that a broker keeps to themselves, and they may share with other brokers in their firm or not, but it's not really about where the property is being advertised. It's probably not being advertised at all if it's a pocket listing. I know some people use the term interchangeably with PLNs, but I don't see them as the same thing. Again, it's all about what disclosures are being made to the sellers in particular in these situations, and whether or not they fully understand what the limiting aspects of the advertising is going to do to their listing and the impacts it might have on their time on market and sales price.
Jessica, the question sort of why now? When we did a consumer survey of recent home sellers in January, and we found that 63% of people who sold their home in the last 5 years said that their agent had pitched them on using a PLN. Prior to that, only 18%. So you're seeing agents and brokerages increasingly pitching sellers on putting their listings off the MLS in these private listing networks. And the problem, I think, comes down to education. It's, what we just heard, it's about disclosure. So when 2/3 of consumers say they don't know the difference between a PLN and the MLS. And then we did an agent survey a couple of weeks ago where more than half of all agents actually thought that their seller would get a higher price off market than on market, when the data clearly shows that's not true. We have a real education issue here. Agents are mistaken. Consumers don't understand, what their options are and what helps them and what hurts them. And I think part of this is because some of these large brokerages have a vested interest in trying to keep that transaction inside the brokerage. so that they get the commission on the buy side and the sell side. So it's great for a large brokerage who can get more commission dollars, but it's really at the expense of the sellers and the buyers.
Yeah, very good. Art, can I get you to weigh in on your perspective of that as far as what we are currently seeing, a growing use of private listing networks by brokerages? Are we seeing a lot of that becoming more and more of a thing? And while you're on that, can you talk a little bit about that difference between a private listing and a pocket listing and how that would be construed from your perspective?
Yeah, I would completely agree with the way that Janet, kind of framed that aspect between the difference between a private listing and a pocket listing. As far as, there's a policy that NAR propagated in 2019 and 2020 called the Clear Cooperation Policy. And the Clear Cooperation Policy basically stated within 1 day of marketing a property, that property must go into the multiple listing service. And that policy is up for discussion again in the industry. We implemented it 4 years ago, and there are quite a bit of discussions going on by individuals in the industry who want to have that policy repealed, primarily because of the private listing network issue. It goes back to transparency and access to data, especially on the buy side. There's also a lot of discussion about days on market and price changes. Should that be information that is disseminated to the consumer? And we have a belief within the CRMLS system that those things are important, that transparent exchange of information, no matter if it is something that might disadvantage a seller in a transaction, it's factual. And, instead of letting the courts decide what's factual and not, let's step up and say that being transparent is what is best for the industry across the board.
And
Yeah.
if you zoom out and think about sellers, at a macro level, displaying days on market and price changes are good for sellers insofar as when you're looking to list your home and trying to figure out how to price it. If that information about how long it took homes to sell is hidden from you, you're going to make errors in pricing. And we had the earlier comment about appraisers as well. So I think, we have this amazing, transparent, liquid market here in the United States. And anytime we try to hide information, hide listings, I think ultimately it leads to consumer harm.
And it's difficult for the multiple listing service to know how many days might have occurred where a property was marketed through a PLN and not on the multiple listing service. Recognize that well north of 90% of the listings that start out on a PLN end up in CRMLS anyways. So they are not all that effective in that pricing structure. When we instituted CCP in 2020, we had an influx of over 750 more listings on a monthly basis coming into our system because of that policy. And it's one of the reasons why we think it's important to keep it.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of good arguments made on both sides of the clear cooperation and multiple suggestions to not ditch the CCP, but to more modify it maybe. Have any of you heard some suggestions that have come forward on modifications and what they could be or what they might be? I know a lot of it's maybe speculation, but can anyone propose a modified CCP with options for listing brokers that would basically satisfy both sides? I don't know who wants to take that first. So, Art, if you want to go there first, and
it's a difficult question. We do support CCP with some changes. There's an office exclusive aspect of CCP, which allows people to aggregate all of their offices in the state of California, for instance, and include those as office exclusives, every listing that they get in the state of California. Marketing has got to be looked at in a little bit better of a way because there are some limited things that agents do run into when it comes to marketing that property and what crosses that line in between submission into the MLS and being able to keep it off market. So there are some suggestions out there that we would be supportive of.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned that 90% of the pocket listings eventually land on the MLS. How do you think this impacts what a buyer sees as the quote number of days on a real estate is on the market? I know there's a lot of conversations about DOM and days on market. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, just based off of some of our calculations, it could have a 20 to 30 day swing with properties as the days that they've been on market. Everybody wants to report a sale, but that's part of the problem with the PLNs is that some of these sales may have occurred off market and they're just reporting it into the multiple listing service. But by our best calculations, it could affect it 20 to 30 days.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, again, you've got this problem where even if a seller ends up being unsuccessful on a private network and putting it in the MLS, it's taking them a lot longer to sell. There's harm associated with that, especially when one of the top two things that sellers are looking for is to sell within their desired time frame. But equally importantly, a seller may accept an offer off MLS, think they've done well, not realizing had they put it in the MLS, they actually would have gotten more. Nationwide, 5,000 more. Where art is, probably 30,000 more. And that seller simply isn't aware that they walked away from that additional money.
It is completely non-intuitive that less exposure to any product is going to lead to a better sales price.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Laurie, let's shift it back a little bit to how this is affecting fair housing laws and what's out there. Do you know any of the selling points that are being pushed out there that would utilize or convince sellers to use a PLN that might be that would probably be not good for fair housing? And are you aware of any of that?
I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit already in terms of the potential, segregation, discriminatory impacts. You posed the question to Janet about if it may be become a regulatory issue, and because it's historically been controlled and policed by the industry. But I'll say the unpopular thing in that the industry has not always done a bang up job of policing itself. And so, with the growing reemergence, if you will, of these private listing networks, pocket listings, et cetera, there's a high probability of furthering adverse impacts for marginalized buyers. We've seen some really great progress, especially over the last 5 years, when it comes to fair housing and awareness of the history of housing in this country. But I see it as a potential huge step backward in terms of consumers as a whole, but particularly consumers of color, consumers from marginalized groups, and by extension, the real estate agents and realtors that serve those particular groups, because it's really all kind of interconnected in terms of networks and communities and who serves who, and just that greater real estate community as a whole. Unfortunately, it's I feel very strongly, and NAFA has repeatedly stated that there are really significant potential harms that could come from these.
Yeah, and I know you guys have also put out a lot of reports on your websites too, of research and statistics that do that. So I'm glad that you guys have put a really good bringing attention to it and awareness. Let's shift gears a little bit and say there's numerous arguments against PLNs, but almost to an overwhelming point. But is there any merit to the counter argument that banning PLNs would interfere with the seller's personal right to determine how they would want their home marketed? Errol, let me have you take that one first, and then chime in anytime, Laurie or Janet, if you have any thoughts on it.
I think sometimes the people who are proponents of private listing networks fail to mention that the current system provides plenty of choice to sellers today. So, for example, If you don't want your home to be displayed on any public website, there's a flag in the MLS called no internet. You simply click no internet. It doesn't appear on Zillow or Realtor.com or Redfin or anywhere else. It's still in the MLS so that other agents and their buyers have access to that listing. But the general public isn't seeing it. You can, in most MLSs, suppress the property address if you're worried about safety or privacy concerns. You can suppress the photos. So the option for privacy is already there. So I think sometimes the privacy argument is quite frankly a little overblown. On the other hand, if you wish to obscure days on market or price changes, I think that actually leads to a dysfunctional market. I think we need information transparency. That's what makes the US market so much better than the market in Europe or in Australia or elsewhere, where there's a real lack of information. So I think on the balance, we need listings to be widely marketed. We need transparency. And if you, for some reason, are willing to trade price in order to get preferred privacy, today's systems already support that.
And we feel that there's a natural mechanism through a non-exclusive agreement where, if there is such a need for privacy, entering into a non-exclusive agreement, our agents and brokers can do that and not trigger anything with CCP. Non-exclusive does bring on the risk that anybody can bring a buyer to that property, but if it's such a high risk that you're entering into NDAs and things just to provide exposure to the property, it is a perfect example of a way to answer this for those fringe cases. And we believe that it is just fringe cases of people that would benefit from being off MLS.
Laurie, Janet, any thoughts on that?
Just say, from time to time, we do see new things in the marketplace. This isn't exactly a new thing. It's been around for a while. It just seems to be growing a little bit right now. And the market tends to adjust itself and work around these things unless they are specifically prohibited for some reason. And in this case, I really do believe it's all about adequate and full disclosure. If these private listing networks are going to continue, I just think there has to be adequate and full disclosure. And then there's got to be a way to access the data for the marketplace.
Definitely. Well, you guys are doing really good with these questions. I do want to emphasize here that these questions are being asked from the audience. So they are coming in. And for those of you that are listening, I do want to encourage you to scan that QR code on the slide that's on your screen and submit your questions, because while we've got these brilliant minds all in one place to talk about this and bring awareness to this, we definitely want to know that we are meeting some of your expectations on these questions. So let's go from the perspective of a question that was submitted and say, what would you say to a high net worth seller who simply doesn't want the public or even most agents to know that their home is for sale? You want me to pick someone?
I would go back to the statement that I just made about going the non-exclusive route, because then the agent can very closely monitor who gets access to that information, gets access to the home, and it is a much more limited process. Somebody also asked, what percentage do we feel? We feel it is far north or far south of 5%, is that there would even really be a compelling reason. You're talking about judges, you're talking about police officers, you're talking about political figures that might have a reason to not have the exposure. But for the vast majority of the consuming public, exposure is what they need and what they need most.
And as I mentioned earlier, the MLS system today supports the ability to keep it private. So it's not appearing on the internet. You can suppress the address, you can suppress the photos. And so you can achieve a level of privacy in the current system that I think will meet the needs of most people who, whether you're a high net worth individual or whether you're a celebrity, that will meet their needs.
And Jessica, I would add to that, just anecdotally, and what I've seen, on social media, the entities and the agents who are promoting the private listing networks, I've never once seen anyone use that really as a marketing hook that, hey, if you need privacy because you're a celebrity or there's some type of a safety issue, there are options for you. It's all about either recruiting clients or recruiting other agents that, hey, we have this secret, sneaky stash of properties just for you. And so it doesn't really address the issues that my co-panelists have talked about that are very real and valid in terms of the need for privacy. There's already a system there in place for those. So it's everything I'm seeing is really all about the exclusivity and the private rather than privacy.
And when we looked at those 3 million listings, we did not see that the listings sold off MLS skewed to the upper portion of the market. There are a lot of the bottom 5%, bottom 35%, where sellers are being convinced to list their listing off MLS. So that high net worth argument isn't borne out by the data.
Interesting. Well, we also have another question that says that there was an argument that professional home builders and developers have been operating outside of clear cooperation. Aren't PLNs the same playbook, but for consumers?
Right? Can I take this one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely not. So we do a lot of work with builders. The top 20 builders in the country are all customers of ours. And what you'll see is that the builder, first of all, is generally marketing a community. These homes aren't built yet, right? So they're saying it's a new community. Here are the 5 home plans you can choose from. Here's the lots that we have available. Most MLSs do not support the functionality to pick a lot and pick a plan and match them up. But secondarily, these builders are not hiding this inventory in some private network. So all the big builders have their communities and their listings on Zillow, on Realtor.com, on Redfin. They're widely available. So you don't have the situation where a buyer is not getting access to the inventory. You're not having the fair housing issues. So it's a different type of product, and you don't have the builders hiding the content. They're putting it out there widely.
And to a large extent, a lot of the large builders input their listings into the MLS anyways.
Once they're built, yeah. That's right. Yep.
I guess that would lead to the next question in saying, do you think that part of the reason why for the increase in private listing networks and the rise of PLNs coming on is due to the fact that the MLS can no longer list the commission to the buyer's agent? You're shaking your head no.
No, it's for other reasons. And as Laurie had already alluded to, it's for an exclusivity pitch. It is for a brand pitch. It is for a recruiting pitch. It's not because the offer of compensation is not there.
Any other thoughts on that?
No, I would agree. In conversations that I have had and seen, most of the folks that I've been in contact with say that particular new rule has not had an adverse or really almost any impact on their business practices at all. So I would argue that that's not really a valid argument for them.
Yeah, very good. Gina, any thoughts on that?
I would not think that the private listing networks would be that the number would be increasing because of that issue. Because if you're they're still going to be sharing commissions amongst themselves within a firm. There's still going to be some commission sharing that's going on, or some payment of commissions and negotiations about commissions going on the back end on the contract end of things. I don't see that as being a reason for this rise.
Interesting, yeah. Well, clarify, Errol, if you would, can you tell, I know we've referenced a little bit about the research paper that came out and the statistics and the articles can you tell us, tell everyone in the audience where they could find that report? I know we've referenced it a couple of times. But also, while you're on that, Zillow views MLSs as publicly available listing platforms. What about those that don't have public-facing portals? So two-part question.
Yeah. Okay. So part one, if you go to zillow.com/research, you can get the report. And also, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, we detail our methodology about how we conducted the survey. So you can get a sense for what we did there. And then the question was viewing MLS as a public, a means for public display. You're right. A number of MLSs don't have their own public website, but every MLS has a mechanism to distribute the listings to other brokers to display on the broker site, and also to display on portals like Zillow, like Realtor.com, like Redfin. And so even if the MLS itself isn't operating a public website, they are powering the MLSs across this country, tens of thousands of websites that provide that equal access to the listing inventory.
For sure. Yeah. It seems like the opposite of private, obviously, is public. So how would you define an MLS that is not theoretically a public network?
Do you want to take that, or shall I?
Can you clarify what you're meaning by I think that, obviously the MLS is only it is a business platform accessible only to those that are licensed in the state of California in my case. But the exposure to the listing data that is input into my system by those professionals is, we want it to go everywhere that our members want it to go. And as Errol alluded to, I would guess that there's hundreds of thousands of websites across the country that display MLS data, given the fact that I'm displaying it on north of 20,000 just within the CRMLS footprint.
Yeah, I know that the network has become very, very large on that. And so talking about that again, I know that there's a lot of arguments against PLNs. How has it become so large in California, and what are the benefits? How are the homes marketed? Can they still be emailed to the buyer? Can you describe that a little bit more about how those are being worked?
Yeah, and most PLNs do allow a transfer of the listing data to the buyers that they're working with, but you have to be registered as a buyer in that PLN. There are some private listing networks out there that just target 10% of the marketplace, 10% of the agent marketplace, and it is very limiting in the exposure that the listings that are input into that system, the exposure that they get. So as to the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the MLS where it is going hundreds of thousands of places, and it is very, very easy to find the listing inventory in a market area that you're looking into.
And Janet made the point earlier that for a buyer to get access to those listings in the private network, the buyer is now obliged to go work with that brokerage, even if they have another agent they'd prefer to work with. They in order to get past that velvet rope, and the cover charge you have to pay is working with that brokerage. And by the way, it gives that brokerage a lot more flexibility in charging higher commission rates, because if pay the price or you don't get in. And if you sort of take this to its natural conclusion, I think if PLNs continue to proliferate, you'll see not just one PLN, but 5 or 6 of the biggest brokerages in the country, all with their own PLNs, and the inventory that was formerly freely available in multiple vehicles now sits in these balkanized databases. And so you very, very quickly lose transparency in the market. You also end up seeing brokerage consolidation, as the smaller brokers can't compete with these big brokers who have the exclusive inventory.
And Errol, I'll kind of piggyback off of that, because there's a question that I see in our chat here, or a comment really, about PLNs being just a way for agents to try and double-side a deal. And while I won't comment on that one way or the other, I do see potential, and I hadn't really thought about this, the potential for problems with representation and agency.
Yeah, very good. Laurie, you've discussed potential fair housing violations through the use of PLNs. Can you be a little more specific and give examples of how sellers or agents could unintentionally expose themselves to these violations? So looking at it from unintentional.
Sure. An unintentional, that really gets into a very broad territory. I'm sure most of us are familiar with Long Island Divide, with a lot of the big stories about steering and things that have happened. So a lot of that, um, a lot of it is not intentional. A lot of the bias, and there's been a ton of education on this in the past few years. Um, but we do know that, and not just agents, it's a little bit of human nature, that people tend to associate with, work with, et cetera, folks who look like them, are similar to them, are aligned with them in many ways. And so you naturally work within those particular networks, and that unintentionally, again, excludes other folks. So you're kind of funneling your business to the folks in your own personal community, your own personal network, and that again unintentionally leaves other folks out. So it reduces the transparency, it reduces the number of eyes on properties, and just kind of shrinks the market as a whole. And really, it's a huge step backwards. You know, we've made so many strides as an industry in overcoming the rather painful history of housing in this country, and this really just kind of steps it backwards back towards that place of separation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Another question that we have that has been put in is, and I'll read it word for word, this feels like it could be opening some large national brokers to lawsuits. I know I'm not an attorney, but what would the potential risk be for these large brokers pushing a PLN without the proper disclosures? Janet, that might be one that you could pick up on for sure, being
I mean,
an
I
attorney.
think, yeah, I think you will see more potential fair housing issues, and these could be involve civil lawsuits as well. It could be a situation where if a particular brokerage is running a private listing network, that it may be not only the broker that gets named in the lawsuit, but the firm as well, the brokerage as well. So I think that there is some potential liability there for them, and they're all going to have to be aware of that. It's out there.
Anecdotally, we're already hearing of those lawsuits popping up.
And Janet, not just the brokerage, the individual agent as well. They're culpable for fair housing violations. So we're talking about a pretty broad swath of individuals and entities who could be involved in potential lawsuits.
That's correct. And I think even if the lawsuit isn't successful in the end, the lawsuit itself can be damaging for a brokerage or for the individual brokers too. So these are things that they're going to have to think about.
Yeah, very good. Another question that we've had posted is, can you speak more about the days on market and CDOM and how it affects market stats? Art, that may be one headed to your direction.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in relationship to the PLN, it does skew those market stats. And part of why this discussion is so pertinent is that there are going to be some decisions made on CCP shortly. And our concern is that if CCP goes away, you're going to see an explosion. As Errol has already alluded to, I know of some of the large brokerages that in order to be competitive, they've got to head down this road if CCP is gone. So, you're going to see more of this occurring, and we'll still probably have 50 to 70% of the listing content, depending on the market, but you still get skewed numbers when it comes to what the sales prices were in that current micro market, and what days on market, what price changes occurred, just all of the different things that agents rely on in order to price properties and to effectively talk to their sellers and to their buyers.
Yeah, and it might be helpful too, or only because I know we have a lot of people on this call. Can you just very quickly explain the difference between DOM and CDOM and what that means and how that's determined?
Yeah. DOM is days on market, and it just is a linear count from the listing date to the date that it actually sells, goes pending. And cumulative days on market occurs in a situation where there might be a contract cancellation and a new agent would list that property. The cumulative days on market, as long as it hasn't been relisted if it's relisted within 90 days, in our case, it basically keeps that count going. So if you have a situation where a consumer fires their agent and immediately lists with another agent, that cumulative days on market is important because it counts all of the days that property was currently for sale during that marketing cycle.
Thank you. I know that's helpful to know when there's so many acronyms going on and what that means on things. So another question that we had posted or that was posted and we didn't touch too much on, but in the area of antitrust, it's the question posted was, sounds like a bit of an antitrust issue. Also, if certain agents are not members or allowed to be members of PLNs. And then the question goes on to say, it is my understanding that a group of agents can't conspire collectively to not work with another group of agents. Do PLNs fall under this? Janet, that might be one for you there.
Oh, I hate that you sent that one to me, but is that going to be viewed as an antitrust violation? I don't know. It could be. Potentially. I don't really know. I think that there's a lot of talk about antitrust right now and what constitutes an antitrust violation, and I think everyone has to be cognizant that that's an issue that's out there. And whether or not brokers are independent contractors, they may be working and being affiliated with a firm, but they're typically independent contractors. So it's not like it's a firm with employees that has this kind of a listing that's closed. It's independent contractors coming together, and maybe that's going to be enough. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
And I know that, the antitrust, any of those issues would go further outside of just the regulatory license law that your commission is overseeing. But I think that it's important to note that if there's a law in place that whether it's on a public MLS or a private network, the law still applies either way. So same thing with antitrust and those issues there as well. So. Well, I will tell you we are wrapping up, so I will ask a final question here for you all and ask again, want to say thank you to all of our panelists and everybody that was here. But in the final question here, I'm going to start off with Errol. I'll pitch this one to you. Why does Zillow want transparency with listings, but steering potential clients towards members of their Premier Agent program instead of a listing agent? With 2/3 of the real estate traffic, it puts them at a massive advantage to all the other brokers. Now, the reason why I post that is the last question. It was one that was submitted in the group here. So, Errol, if you will take just a quick minute to wrap that up and answer that, that'd be great. Oh, and you're on mute. So close.
So close. Our advertising platform is open to all agents, so there's equal opportunity there. What you will find is that a lot of consumers use Zillow, but then work with an agent other than one of our Premier agents. The only real criteria for being an advertiser on our platform is that you do a good job, so that you are responsive. So we measure response times, that you get good customer satisfaction scores. But our goal is to provide the information freely to everybody, and then they can choose to work with whoever they choose to work with.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I will tell you to all of our esteemed panelists, we still have 16 more questions we could get to, as we've had a lot of interest in this. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to them in this time that's allotted for today. However, I will tell you that both ARELLO and Zillow are looking at doing a part 2 on this, and this will actually be held in person during the ARELLO mid-year meetings in San Diego. And those meetings are being held April 14th through the 16th in San Diego, California. We invite anyone to participate in the ARELLO meetings, and you can find the information at arello.org. But I know that this will continue to be a conversation going forward. So thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for helping raise the bar of professionalism in our industry. So any final thoughts before we conclude? Excellent. Well, thank you all for your time. Thank you for being here today. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Jessica.
much.